an academic conference, donuts. Those of you who are from Boston know there's a Dunkin' Donut in every corner, but at Berkeley, that's a hard find. Okay, so I'm extremely happy to introduce Sendhil Mullainathan that is going to speak today. He's from the University of Chicago, and he's an amazing researcher who's done, has enabled us to understand a lot of the choices that are made in machine learning and what's the problem with them, and understanding sort of complex behavior of humans and social policy, and especially in medicine and in other areas. And he's a MacArthur Fellow, and he has been recognized all over the world for his pioneering work. And I met him during the privacy, program at Simon's. The first year that I was here, there was actually wrong at the root workshop, where you explained to us why what we were doing was wrong at the root. But thank you so much for coming, and I'm really looking forward to your talk.
Thank you very much. Today I'm going to talk about a topic that is at its heart theoretical, but I'm only going to be presenting something empirical. And the reason for that is that I hope to invite all of you into seeing that in this empirical work that's been ongoing, there is a big conceptual hole. And I'm going to try and use the data and the results in this one particular study to highlight an unmodeled aspect. And that unmodeled aspect is at the intersection between algorithms and people, and in particular, as I say here, fragile algorithms, but fallible people. The place where we've seen that intersection the most is on issues of algorithmic bias, which is very familiar, I think, to most of you by now. So I'm not going to talk about that issue today. It's obviously very important, but exactly because that particular issue is so well trod and modeled, I want to cast a different net, a bigger net at the intersection between people and algorithms. So let me start with a very concrete problem. Imagine you're a doctor in an emergency room and a patient comes in clutching their chest, complaining of chest pain, perhaps shortness of breath, perhaps trouble breathing, nausea. Now, immediately one thought that will come to mind for you is the person having a heart attack? Now, for most of you, you might think, oh, are they having a heart attack? Well, that's either they're going to die or not, or if they've had one and they've survived. But in fact, it's not as simple as that. Even if somebody's had a heart attack, the nausea, the chest pain, and it passes, it's very important to figure out, did they just have a heart attack? And the reason for that is that after a heart attack, there is scar tissue left behind. And if that's not dealt with, there are some long-term consequences. The long-term consequences are pretty severe, including another heart attack and higher rates of mortality. The reason it matters to find out is because we now can do something about it. If you realize this person in front of you just had a heart attack, there is treatment called stenting, which can go in and in fact deal with this problem. And in randomized control trials, you see big reductions in mortality and other consequences. So a person comes in, and what you have to decide is, oh my goodness, am I going to treat them for a possible heart attack? Well, the benefits of the treatment depend on whether they had such a blockage. And so what you really need in this problem, to go back to this original patient, is you need to be able to say, I see this patient. What I'd love to do is to have a test to figure out if they're having a heart attack. So this is what the emergency room doctor ultimately is facing. Now, there are some cheap tests. You can just do an EKG, you can do blood work, but unfortunately those cheap tests, which you can do pretty much on everybody, are not that conclusive. So this brings us to the heart of the decision I want to talk about today. The doctor faced with this patient must decide whether to do one of these better tests that are also incredibly expensive. When I say expensive, I don't just mean dollars. I also mean they're very, very invasive and have some problems, some health problems of themselves that they could raise. So how should the physician go about deciding whom to test and whether it's worth testing? So I'll put up a very simple framework here that is, well, simple. It's too complicated, but we'll bring it back to simplicity for a second. Faced with the patient, the physician has to make this testing decision. The test produces a test result, which then leads to this stenting decision. And if there's a blockage, there'll be a positive test result. So who to test? Well, notice from this that the benefits of the test depends on whether a blockage is found. So ideally, what you'd like to test is those with high enough prior probability of having a heart attack. That's the ultimate rule. In this very complicated situation, you have to form a prior belief, given everything I see, is this person high risk? And if they're high enough risk, test them. Notice in this case, the treatment decision follows pretty mechanically. If the test is positive, treat them. If not, don't treat them. So let's simplify this a little bit and notice there's a pretty canonical kind of graphical model we can set up here. Given a patient, the physician forms a prediction. And on the basis of that prediction, they will test or not test. This should be very familiar to you. And we call these problems sort of prediction policy problems. And let me just run you through how this type of situation is a kind of decision that appears in the world and is distinct from another kind of decision. So let me put this on the left. Patient, predict the test produces a result. Here, predictions are core. But of course, a lot of times, for example, when you're making treatment decisions, causality is core. That is, the doctor must decide, will this treatment have an effect? I point this out because I think very often when thinking about human decision-making, there's a focus on causal and causation and experiments. In fact, all of medicine appears to be about the machinery of experiments. But in fact, as you see in this example, we have one experiment that tells us the benefits of stenting. And then we leave in the doctor's hands millions of decisions that are essentially predictions. Even though both are statistical activities that need to take place, not weirdly, but the right-hand side has been dealt with a lot. The left-hand side has been left to human judgment, largely speaking. And so what I want to talk about a little bit today, I'll skip this bit here, is that many, many problems share this structure. So I hope that while we talk about the testing decision today, you can immediately see this applies to many things. So I'll just give you an example. In the criminal justice system, judges must predict whether a defendant poses a particular risk and release them on that basis. In the educational system, the person making admissions decisions must predict the person's eventual performance and admit. In hiring, you must predict skill. In lending, you must predict financial health. We can kind of keep going like this. All these problems have this shared structure. And in this shared structure, the prediction structure kind of lends them very naturally to say, oh, this looks like a machine learning problem. In fact, I haven't said it, but it was probably pretty obvious to all of you. We're taking characteristics and predicting something. There you go. And so what I want to tell you today is that I'm going to apply what is a kind of obvious machine learning to this problem. But what I hope to do in the application is reveal to you that this is not an obvious application of machine learning, that it should not be. The field is a little bit heading in that direction, but it shouldn't be heading in that direction. That there is structure underneath these models that should be better modeled, and that better modeling will, I think, eventually lead us to better applications. So let me start with the mechanical approach. The mechanical approach would be say, oh, so you're telling me you just need to predict whether the person has a blockage. Let me just go ahead and do that. Let me get a bunch of data and let me build a risk predictor for a patient as to whether they have a blockage. And then I'll just compare the risk predictor to the doctor and I'll just see who does better. Okay, so let's just run through that a little bit. So first is to build, then to compare. And in the compare part, it's going to look like the usual horse race. Oh, does the algorithm beat the doctor? Okay, so let's start with the building part. So for the building part, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a bunch of data we have in a large health system, and I'm going to take everything that we know up to this point, which is, oh, I keep hitting the wrong button. So this is the emergency room visit, and this is the anchor point. I'm going to take everything that's known up to that point and just throw it into a prediction. And the outcome I'm going to predict is the outcome of the test. Did this person have a blockage? Okay, that's going to produce a pretty straightforward predictor using a large set of people. Great. I'm going to pause here to make one very, very, very nitpicking point, but it is important because without this point, some other issue is going to be lost. So let me make this nitpicking point. What exactly do I use at the time of the visit? So there's a couple of data that we have available. For example, the demographics, the diagnosed conditions, all of that. That's one set of data. There's another set of data we have, which is like, what was the patient's chief complaint? What did they say to the triage nurse? Now, we're going to use only, you guys should start making bets of whether by the end of this talk, I will figure out which one is which button. I'm not sure myself. Okay, so we're not going to use this data, the narrative story, et cetera. The reason we're not going to use that is because this data is not reliably available. What do I mean by reliably available? If you go into the data frame, the way chief complaint and especially the narrative stories are recorded, they're recorded after the patient encounter, which means that the doctor kind of knows what's already happened when they go to write down what the patient said. So there's a ton of information leakage here. Okay, this is going to be important in our story later, but we're not going to use any of this information. And we're just going to use everything we knew about the patient before they walked into the emergency room. All right, so I'll just build a simple algorithm using these data. I'm going to show you all the results in the holdout set. And what would we do next? Well, we should just ask the algorithm I just built, what is its AUC relative to the AUC of the doctor? But there's a problem. There is no AUC of the doctor. Algorithms make predictions. Doctors don't make predictions. Doctors make decisions. Their predictions are implicit in their decisions. The simple act that we're used to in running horse races between two algorithms becomes nearly impossible in every one of these situations. We can't simply compare predictions. We only have their decisions. So as a first pass, we have to compare the consequences of the predictions and compare decisions and form counterfactuals. Okay, so that's the first barrier in this kind of problem. So let's think about that. Let's just take my prediction, discretize it at some point. Let's not worry about the detail. What I'll do is I'll take the continuous prediction of blockage and put a threshold, and that'll give the algorithm a suggestion whether to send the patient home or to test, and the physician has a decision whether to send home or test. Of course, when they agree, there's no gain. The net gain is 0 for both. So we need to look at the off-diagonal cells and ask how well do they do? What are the outcomes here? If the algorithm is right and it sends home a patient who the doctor tests, then there will be test costs saved. If the algorithm is right and it tests a patient the physician would have sent home, there's some bad health outcomes that would have been gained. Does that make sense to everybody? So basically, the two gains are very different. If the algorithm is right here, there's dollars saved. If the algorithm is right here, there's lives saved, so to speak. Okay. So now comes the question, well, how would we actually go about calculating these counterfactuals? Well, it's pretty easy. If the algorithm says send somebody home and the doctor tested them, well, let's actually look at what happened to those tests. We can actually see how many of those tests came back positive. And the algorithm sent them home, so we'd see what the negative costs are. So let's have a look at this. With our stuff, with our algorithm, on the x-axis, I put the decile of predicted risk. On the y-axis, I put the actual yield of the tested sample. This population is the lowest decile. The algorithm predicts there's no reason to test these people. And in fact, they have very, very low yield rates. Using well-established cost-benefit calculations, we can decide the threshold at which we want to draw it. But you can already see the low deciles have almost no positive rates. If you convert all this using cost-benefit calculations, you get something that looks like this. X-axis percentile of patients, y-axis cost per life year. This is probably the most embarrassing thing that economists do, is to put dollars on human life. But nevertheless, there we are. And you'll see that at the lowest decile of patients, it is well above any cost effectiveness threshold that anybody ever uses, above about a magnitude, of order of magnitude above. It simply is not at all sensible to test in these lowest quintiles. In fact, you could cut 62.4% of all tests. In fact, you go further, you could just drop 25% and have no noticeable effect on positive yields. They're just not, these people contribute to almost nothing. So if I were to pause here and I want you to consider this, one thing we've seen already here is that at a minimum, the algorithm is identifying a set of patients for whom we are spending lots of dollars. And remember, these tests aren't neutral. We're actually sitting tubes into them, catheterizing them to look for stuff where there is just nothing there. So in that sense, we look like we have some gains, but this calculation only is one side. We've shown that we can cut wasteful tests, but what about the other side of this equation? How do we go about calculating these counterfactuals? Well, let's go back to our graph. I said, look, this is what happens to the low predicted risk. Let's look what happens to the high predicted risk. In the high predicted risk, about 52% find something. That's a very high rate, and you should definitely be testing those people. Except 57% of them go untested. That would almost lead you to say, holy cow, what is going on? But I'm pulling the wool over your eyes for a second. Let's just look at this graph. What could possibly be on the y-axis? It's the yield rate amongst the tested. And then I'm saying it's a 52% yield amongst the tested, 57% are untested. Why don't we test them? But how do we know that the 57% that are untested are anything like, we don't have actual labels for these people. It's just a leap of faith. And in that sense, we could say there's huge gains, but not obviously. We don't know what the test actually would have resulted in if we had tested them. And that's important because this problem I'm about to describe and seeing in this figure is generic. The labels are missing here for this population. It's not missing at random. It's missing exactly because of a choice the physician made. The exact choice that we would like to say the algorithm can do better than. So as a result, this problem, what happens in this cell, the lack of a label, is a recurring theme that happens in many decision tasks. That is, the data is the result of past choices. And that is the deep sense in which, as an empirical matter, comparing humans to machines poses a problem. The decision maker's choices influence what data we see, which perversely makes it harder to evaluate alternative decision rules. It's almost like the physician is deleting the data needed for us to overwrite what they would do. But the important thing here is that we must not be naive in how we go about making this comparison. So let me just give you an almost comical comparison of people and machines. I hope you know which one is a person, which one's a machine. The algorithm has access to more instances, and that is one thing worth keeping in mind. Right now, every single patient who walks into this health system is available to the algorithm. Any given doctor might have seen 10,000. But, and this is the key, the human also has an advantage. And if we're going to make this comparison and understand what happens in that cell for which we don't have data, we have to recognize that the doctor sees more about each instance. If this were a data frame, the algorithm has more rows. The human decision maker has many more columns, many of which never appear in our data set. And to make fair comparisons, we have to do something about the fact that the columns are missing and the labels are missing for those columns. So the patients are not the same in that untested cell. And this is why I went through such pointless detail to point out to you, even with some of the data we had to leave it out. So to make this very stark, we have no idea if the patient walked in and was looking sick or not looking sick. We don't have a photo of what their skin pallor was. There's a lot missing in this data. As an extreme example, let me just tell you one thing that's missing for almost every data set like this that you'll ever see in this healthcare case. The EKG, which is the electrocardiographic readout of the heart. People say, oh, I've got claims data, I've got health records, but the EKG is rarely in the health records. In fact, when we went and got the EKGs and built a new algorithm to predict blockage using the EKGs, which was not in our original algorithm, what you find is on the x-axis is the original predictor. On the y-axis is the risk predictor using the EKG. Notice what the distribution looks like. Everyone's risk goes down. Not everyone, but on average, risk goes down. That's because people look less risky when we add the EKG data. Why is that? Because many of the untested people, in fact, had good-looking EKGs. And when you add that in, and so this is systematically telling you, of course, physicians know something that the algorithm does not know, okay? And so when I said must not be naive in this process, we need a way of accounting for the fact that the physicians have private information that the algorithm doesn't have. So we do have a way of solving this. I will go through this fairly quickly because to get to the major points, but let me talk about, let's go back to the reason we tested in the first place. If you remember, if you don't treat a heart attack that did happen, that has these long-term consequences. But that has the untested in our sample are also the untreated. But as a result, if predicted the high-risk people are in fact truly low risk, the physician knew what they were doing, then what should happen to them over time is that they should have low or no complications. If the predicted high-risk patients are in fact high risk because the physician screwed up, looking over time, we should find that in fact, they went on to have heart attacks at high rates. But we can do this. We can follow this population over time after they're sent home and measure what actually happened to them. And that's what I'm going to show you here. On the x-axis is again the same predicted risk. On the y-axis now is measures of heart attack or death. And what you in fact find is that the very high-risk people who were untested and sent home go on to have future heart attacks and death at very high rates. In fact, the clinical thresholds, I'll go through this, the clinical threshold for testing someone is right around here, which suggests testing everybody in the top quintile would be incredibly cost effective. They're having death and heart attacks at rates about twice the levels at which you would expect to have just said that we should test them. So what this tells you is that in fact, it's not just that the doctor is testing too many people, but the people in the highest risk are in fact being sent home when they should not be being sent home, and they are dying at high rates. So if you go back to this cartoon, it said the doctor sees more about each instance and the algorithm sees more instances. What we have is a situation where we have an analytical advantage by the algorithm. It is finding signal in these data that the doctor is missing, which suggests that humans are fallible. But I want to go back and just point out the doctor also has a contextual advantage, which is they see all these things by these other patients. That contextual advantage is normally what we think of as the fragility of algorithms. It's what leads to things like distribution shift, why when you move from one context to another, the algorithm doesn't do nearly as well. So given these striking results we have right now, what I would like to ask is the question, what should we do with them? Let me just talk about this. We have some other evidence in the paper, which I won't go through. It suggests that there is some potential for some very large gains where we could change not just the costs in the healthcare system, but actually dramatically improve the health of the people walking in, which seems like it's very practically useful. But it's almost useful because all it's really telling us is that the algorithm is finding some signal that the doctor has left on the table. How do we actually go about deploying it? Given the human advantage, and given that there's a bunch of stuff not in the data and we have problems of distribution shift, it's very hard to believe that automation is the efficient solution despite these results. So yes, we know that in this particular narrow case, we might think the algorithm beats the human, but you might almost say, great, then we want to combine them. And what we'd really like is decision aids. And this is where I want to pause. There are many problems that are working their way towards this point where there is a problem that looks like this. There's some data, there's some compelling evidence using natural experiments, using stuff like we've been describing that says, yes, the algorithm appears to find signal. And the reason for that is because humans are pretty biased at extracting statistical information from data sets. It's just, they're not great at it. And that point you say, well, we must build decision aids. But what does it mean to build a decision aid? How will we even model this problem? we sort of have to model how humans react to advice. Is it obvious that if you give a decision aid that the doctor is going to respond in the cases where the aid knows something and the doctor doesn't? What if they only respond in the case where the algorithm tells them something that they already believe, but not in the case where it doesn't believe? You could be making matters worse. It's hard to know how you build a decision aid without even modeling the human being. And I don't know of many, and this is the invitation I'd like to extend to you, is to start to pull at this thread and show you we just don't have ways of thinking about this problem. We have theories like information design, and perhaps that's the right way of thinking about it. But here's the one Achilles heel of information design. Those type of models, they presume a rational agent, but we wouldn't be in this mess if the agent was perfect at extracting the information from the data. So that's one puzzle. Let me go a little further. Even in thinking of it as a decision aid, are we thinking too narrowly? To do this, let's go back and say, well, so far we've tried things like, is the algorithm better than the human? Can we combine them? But there are other operators. What if we had the algorithm not predict blockage, but actually predict what the physician will do? Could the algorithm be a way of diagnosing, not heart attack, but diagnosing the error in physician decision-making? In principle, we could do that because we could take the cases and predict physician judgment and ask, in which cases does that contrast with predicted risk and what happens in those cases? Let me just give you an example of one thing that happens there, just so you get a flavor of what those results look like. I'm going to build such an algorithm, and the way I'm going to build this algorithm is predict physician decision-making using a risk predictor. But instead of using the best risk predictor and seeing whether physicians respond to that, I'm going to build a set of risk predictors. And the way I'm going to build a set of risk predictors is I'm going to allow the risk predictors to vary in complexity. This is the simplest risk predictor. This is the most complex risk predictor. Obviously, as you keep going in this direction, there's overfitting. So on the top curve, I'm showing you what happens to risk, how well the risk predictor predicts risk. And you can see the overfitting that happens. As I get more and more complex, you can see there's a drop-off in performance. So this is the overfitting that happens. So the best risk predictor uses about 224 variables to predict risk. The second curve shows you which risk predictor predicts physician behavior the best. And you'll notice, interestingly, that's a much simpler risk predictor. In other words, the best predictor of how a physician is going to choose involves a model of risk that's significantly simpler than the best model of risk. Physicians appear to be using a much smaller set of information to make their decisions than what the algorithm would use. And in fact, if you take their set of information, and these are the variables in the small risk predictor, and correlate it with risk or correlate it with the test decision, physicians are doing a remarkable job at putting weight on the variables roughly the way the algorithm would have put weight on the variables. So this part almost makes it seem like they're boundedly rational. They use a simple set, a small set, but they use that set pretty well, with one noteworthy exception. If the reason for the visit was chest pain, physicians weigh that much more heavily in their testing decision than any relationship with risk. And so what you tend to find here is physicians ignore this long tail of information and they overweight salient representative symptoms like chest pain. And we talk a little bit more about this. And part of what I want to just highlight is that this hopefully helps you see that the design space cannot just be, I give a decision aid. Because if I just give a decision aid, it means there's a ton of other information that the algorithm may have about where the decision maker is wrong that then could also play into a role. And so it feels like there's some, and let me conclude on this bit, it feels like if we're going to make progress in this area, what we need to understand is we need to understand what is the design space that is at the intersection between these two agents. Even something like decision aids is far too narrow. Even something, so what is all the information that could be given that there are two entities that have some understanding of the situation, and how do we model the design space of what goes back and forth? And this requires a model of people, a model of algorithms, and importantly, a model of what this interaction space looks like. And that's what I will leave open here. And I hope that this is a problem that some of you get interested in, because at least in the empirical work, you see this appearing in many, many places. And it is kind of one of those unexplored areas that I think theory of the type you all do could be incredibly valuable. All right, thank you.
And are there any questions? Costas.
Thank you, Sendhil. Very interesting talk. I had a question about when you drew this square where, comparing the decisions of the algorithms and so forth. I'm curious, so how did you train your algorithm? Your algorithm was presumably trained on data of people tested, right? I mean, so this is data that is not missing at random. So there is already bias going into your algorithm, into the data that your algorithm has access to train itself. Nevertheless, there was enough signal to do better than the doctors who filtered the data. Is that what happened there?
First of all, 100%, you have it exactly right. This is trained on just the tested set. But what you're implying is also something very important, which is if you had a model of how the decision aid was going to be used, it's hard to believe that the right training would just be to train naively on the testing set. So I think an understanding of what's going to happen downstream should surely even have implications of who you even train on. Why are we treating this population the same? Why aren't we changing the training procedure? I totally agree.
Any more questions?
Thanks for the fascinating talk. So I guess just had a, so I guess one way we know of improving simple algorithms is to kind of give them new examples, which we know that this algorithm is doing badly on. So I guess this is sort of the idea behind boosting, multiplicative weights. So I guess if we think of the human itself as the algorithm we are trying to improve, could we kind of use some of these examples that you've found where the human made a mistake, like basically all the features that the human was ignoring? Could we perhaps use those to design, kind of do some kind of curriculum learning, kind of create new, well, show doctors examples of patients where they would perhaps have made the wrong decision? Do you think there's hope of doing something like that?
Oh, it's awesome. Yeah, no, and I think that's exactly the kind of thinking this area needs, because in some sense, taking these ideas like boosting and stuff you've seen in pack learning and say, well, let me just turn it back around and view the human as this box that I can then give examples to. And you could even think of finding not just instances they've done well. Maybe you want to find instances that look very similar, pairs of instances where they look similar, one which they get wrong. I mean, there's just a lot when you pull that thread. And I think that's exactly the kind of stuff this area needs.
Okay, thank you very much again. And also thank you for coming